Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to spend the next few minutes with you talking about how we can look through the lens of creative placemaking. Now, I'm going to expect that most of you know about the word creative placemaking. Perhaps you've practiced it to some degree. I'm also going to bet that we may not all be on the same page as to exactly what it is. So today we're going to look at that definition. We're going to show you why this is a valuable approach to your community and economic planning. And then we're going to take a brief look at the actual process of creative placemaking with a hyper focus of our lens on the first two steps of that process. So, without further ado, let's look at the definition of creative placemaking. What it is a planning process which deliberately integrates the arts and culture into your community work, and what it is steeped in is a deep cross-sector partnership. A more simple definition, and the one that we use at the Center for Creative Placemaking, is the intentional integration of arts and culture into community, social, and economic development planning. And even more simply, it is the creative making of a place. Creative placemaking was brought to this country about 10 years ago under the chairmanship of the National Endowment for the Arts, from Chairman Rocco Landesman, and he had this to say about creative placemaking. As a field, creative placemaking seeks to further enhance and extend understanding of the roles that culture and artists can play in advancing other sectors' work, thus becoming valued, consistent, and fully integrated parts of community planning and economic development. So let's pause for a second and look at the difference between arts and culture. Because I know that sometimes, even I, can get the two words mixed up or use them for the same meaning. Arts in themselves are the common things that we think about as arts: music, dance, video, the design arts more and more, visual arts, theater, the various expressions of creativity, if you will. Now, culture incorporates all that the arts are, as well as culture can be shared beliefs and values of a particular group or of a particular people, their beliefs, their customs, their habits, their history. First, how we interact with our environment, the places in which we live, work, and play, and the way we build our communities must be rooted and shaped by culture. Our habits of consumption, our ideas about nature, how our communities function, what we value as meaningful, what we think of as possible or impossible. Arts and cultural expressions and practices are a tangible vehicle through which individuals and communities form culture in, let's think of it in an anthropological sense, like beliefs and identities, worldviews, our values. Through arts and culture, we interpret and make meaning of our experiences, including the traumatic ones. In the field of creative placemaking, we are, those of us particularly in higher education, are looking through the lens right now of trauma-informed placemaking. And it's a fascinating study and a line for us to, a line of inquiry and research for us to head off on, because it empathetically connects us with other people. Those people who are like us and who are familiar with us, and those whom we do not know and are not familiar with. Now, there's one more thing I want us to think of before we get into the process of creative placemaking. This is not a quick fix. We spend a lot of time in the field of practice focused on projects, and projects are great. There's a reason that we started out that way in the field of practice 10 years ago. And there are many people who feel that projects alone can spur further interest by people in our community and will lead to further things. But I believe that all of us would agree that that's a scattershot approach to planning. Let us focus our minds instead on the fact that creative placemaking is a long-term process and a very strategic process. And now let's look at the process itself. There are 5 steps that the Center for Creative Placemaking believes are the process of creative placemaking. First, build your good cross-sector team. Second, conduct your widespread asset inventory. Then analyze and brainstorm through that inventory and think about ways with your cross-sector team to utilize your assets. Develop a plan and then implement your plan. Now, this process is not unique to creative placemaking, but when you apply this process through the lens of creative placemaking, then that's where you find the sweet point. So for our purposes today, we're going to look at the first 2 steps of that process: building your team and conducting your asset inventory. So who should be on your team? Well, one of the first things that I imagine happens in a lot of your municipalities is that your, say, land use planning board will identify a piece of land, for example, that needs to have some love. Is underutilized, or it needs to be readapted and better utilized, or something like that. And they meet with the township council and the mayor, and they all decide that they're going to move forward focused on this piece of land. They put out a bid for investors or developers, and the investors and developers create a plan, and the plans are examined by the municipal officials and the land use board, for example, and some entity is chosen, and then they begin to work together, and they work through the zoning issues, and they work through the tax issues, and so forth and so on. And somewhere far down the line, the community is invited in to share their thoughts after they are presented with the plan. This is not the way that we do creative placemaking. No, we have to build our team from the very beginning. In that scenario I just shared with you, I believe that we would all agree that that is a top-down approach. And creative placemaking is not a top-down approach. It's not a bottoms-up approach, but rather I ask you to think of it as a lateral approach. This core cross-sector team is made up of the people you see listed on this slide, and intentionally including an artist, or an artist at least, or an arts administrator, and intentionally including an activist or community leader from your most disenfranchised community. Your team should be no more than about 10 people. This should be a very strategically determined team, and that everyone on that team has an equal voice. It is when you spread out beyond that that you continue the lateral line as you bring more voices in from the community, hear more perspectives, and so forth and so on. I want to give you a good example of a creative team that did some outstanding work in the Rust Belt states of the United States. As we all will recall, during the recession and even prior to that, the Rust Belt states suffered disproportionately from most of the rest of the country. The economic decline brought about by the auto parts industry and the steel industry, the loss of the steel industry, particularly affected this area where that was a large percentage of the jobs and workforce participation. So if we look at a partnership that formed in Cleveland, Ohio, the county recognized that there were tremendous problems in this town. The town of Cleveland, Ohio, the city of Cleveland, Ohio, between the years 2000 and 2001, lost 17.1% of their population, and over a third of that loss was young adults. In other words, the most active and the future of the workforce in Cleveland. So something had to be done to address that. Cuyahoga County leaders worked with the Cleveland Partnership for the Arts and Culture, or the Community Partnership for the Arts and Culture in Cleveland, and the local CDFI, and brought other key team players to the table. It was a robust, strategically planned team. Now, further, there was, for example, an entity called the Zygote Press, which was a new entrepreneurial business. They went to this team and they said, we need to set up a place of business. We are interested in a foreclosed property in Slavic Village. Slavic Village, at the height of the recession, was a neighborhood in Cleveland. It was a Polish neighborhood in Cleveland where the workforce was almost entirely attached to the auto parts industry. And during the height of the recession, Slavic Village was known as the community in the United States with the highest number of foreclosures. So the Zygote Press worked with the CDFI and this larger partnership to help them purchase this property. Then they determined from that good idea that they were going to put a spotlight on Slavic Village and turn those issues, threats, if you will, of those foreclosures into an asset. So they put together a weekend. They deliberately marketed it far and wide to people of all stripes, young people, older people, businesses, corporations, investors, funders, all kinds of folks, to come in and take a tour of 5 foreclosed homes that they determined to put on this tour. They invited every single community member to participate. They exploited in the best way the culture. People provided food. The few retail establishments that were still opened their doors wide and provided incentives to people. Local musicians came and played. And then the artist in the Zygote Press put artistic installation in each of these 5 homes. Some of them were not habitable, and so they put them on the exterior of the home. And the purpose was, in every instance of this large weekend planned project, pilot project, I might add, was to create an emotive connection and stimulate the imagination of what could be done with these homes. It was wildly successful and became a model upon which this cross-sector team, as you see here, of all of these players, which include, by the way, some national funding entities who provided support and promotion of this project. This became the model that they could go back and apply to the plan that they had already created. Because the plan, when this strategic team sat down together, analyzed their assets, then they did a SWOT analysis, and they identified all of the issues, the threats, and they visioned the anticipated outcomes. So I think that's a great example of what had happened, and I will tell you that last year the New York Times did a profile on Slavic Village about then and now, and we have seen a complete turnaround of that community with very little displacement. So now, let's take a closer look at those assets. What are the assets we have in our community? They are our historic assets, our natural assets, our physical assets, including our systems assets. We can look at the buildings we have in our downtown area, and there are probably some that are underutilized or need to be reimagined or readapted, and we infill. We don't tear them down. We only tear them down and do not disturb the buildings next to them by readapting them or providing like kind of development so that it fits in. This is not Cleveland, Ohio. This is a block in Boston. Here's an example in West Orange, New Jersey, where the old Thomas Edison lab and battery factory, which sat unused and underutilized, but was a dynamic historical asset, was finally reimagined through a deep cross-sector team and community activism into fuller and better use. It still remains as part of Edison Village, but it now contains an additional 640 apartment unit, mixed-use space with retail, pool, a gym, open space for the community, and it completely resides still in the middle of the historic downtown Edison Village in West Orange. Communities of all sizes have assets. Several years ago, I worked with a tiny, tiny little community that was part of a larger township. And when I sat down with their good team, they said, well, we have one artist and we have a community space that's connected to the police department and the small municipal offices. And we have some recreational fields, one or two. And I asked them to look deeper, and we began to identify we began to open our lens wider to the artists. We talked about the culinary artists, the chefs who might be in town, or the entrepreneurial bakers that might be in town. We talked about the crafts people. We talked about the cosmetology artists, the hairstylists, and so forth. Then we looked further into the departments to see what was available there. We looked at further into the schools and what the assets were there and the education community, and so forth and so on. So this is a really great graphic that's put out by the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, which you will all see as Molly will share this PowerPoint presentation with you at the after this webinar. So I want to go back and think about those assets and look at this photo at the top. Now, most of us would drive by and we would think this was an eyesore and would present a big issue and a threat to our community, but not an artist. An artist would drive by and see the photo on the bottom. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but indeed, this is a before and an after picture with some interventions by public artists and intervention by landscape design. Here's some more before and after photos. I imagine most of us have these kinds of overpasses in our townships. We drive under them and we cross over them all the time. We don't think any more about them. We don't think about what kind of image they are presenting for our community, for those who may not live there, or even an image for our local residents. How does this provide any kind of connectivity? If you look at the photos on the right, you can see a reimagining of what those spaces could be. Streets can be closed off temporarily to invite people in. There can be some artistic intervention that makes it connective, that brands, if you will, the community. There can be some simple solutions like allowing parking on either side of this very wide street, where people can use and safely feel that they can have access to the space either by parking their cars there or by walking, biking, there are hikers around. So I want to kind of wind up a little bit here with looking very quickly at some projects, which I will call outcomes from now on, that can be accomplished at little to moderate cost. Creative placemaking can be a very affordable planning process for your community. Let's look at an underutilized parking lot. This hydroponic farmer needed a space. This worked perfectly for her. What if you have a rain, I'm looking at rain right now. What if you have a water problem in your area? And what kind of opportunities can there be to both educate people about the water issues as well as to provide some solutions for the water issues? There are so many places that we could put pervious surfaces or build gardens that can catch stormwater. This is a pretty simple solution, not only in our residences, in our residential homes, and can be a huge community activity, but also in our retail and corporate spaces, even in our shopping centers where there's a small median that's not used for any purpose. It's a great place to plant some foliage and put some pervious surfaces in there. So we can even go so far, if we have a water issue, to a huge intervention. And this slide is a little bit of a joke, but it does exist in the world in a place that is primarily surrounded by water. This is a great program that came out of the city of Minneapolis, and I'm going to take a pause here for a 1-minute video about this. Some of you may be familiar with WaterBar, but if you're not, this is such an easy and a great way to bring your community together and your experts together to talk about water.
A new bar in Minneapolis has several varieties on tap. But I'm not talking about beer, I'm talking about water. Yes, the bar only serves tap water. Not because they're tired of people indulging a bit too much in the good stuff, they want the community to learn. Two things I don't normally associate with my bar experience: water and education. The world's first water bar, opening later this month, is actually a front for a public art display by Works Progress Studio that began in 2014 as a pop-up project and served tap water to 30,000 people across 4 states. The water bar's permanent home in Minneapolis is staffed by artists, water researchers, and sustainability educators. The water is free, and to mimic a real bar experience, you can even get flights of tap water. They have city water, private well water. They even travel to other areas outside of Minneapolis where they have different treatment methods in place, and the head of the organization swears you can tell the difference. The goal is to get people talking about local water and water pollution. Before you eye roll, think of Flint, Michigan. I'm Sean Dowling for Buzz 60. Now you know, pass it on.
And finally, ladies and gentlemen, I want to share with you that creative placemaking is a great way to address particularly difficult community and economic issues. For example, public safety. This project took place along a transit corridor in an exurb of New York City. There were 5 train stations that were in close proximity along this commuter corridor, all experiencing similar problems with public safety and the fear of people to walk through these spaces or close by or have safe access to these places after sunset. So this is a viaduct at one of the transit stations. And they decided to put an emotive connection and a public participation connection around this viaduct where people just didn't go after sunset. A public artist was brought in, and this simple exercise was that she wrapped industrial cellophane around the columns in this viaduct. They brought the community together for a weekend celebration to help paint their ideas and to utilize these paints to make their own expressions. There was music playing outdoors. There was the opening of a whole new pop-up retail space in an underutilized building. It was a wildly popular community event that provided what cognitive scientists say connective tissues on a personal and emotional level, which can help change behavior and opinions. What was wonderful about this pilot project in this one station is that it was taken back to this great cross-sector team across these 3 towns and these 5 transit stations, and further adopted at each one of the other 4 stations. So I leave you today with the ideas and understanding that the big challenges that we have in our communities require new thinking. I believe that that thinking should include the creative placemaking process. And I hope that your takeaways during this webinar have been that you understand a little more about exactly what creative placemaking is and what the value it can bring to your community and economic development. As well, I hope that you realize that it is indeed a process, and that the first and most critical steps of the process are to build a deeply thoughtful and strategic cross-sector team, and to look far and wide at the assets upon which you and your community can build. We invite you, ladies and gentlemen, to join us on one of our social media outlets. If you have further questions, I will be happy to answer them, and you can contact me at the email listed on this slide. And just one further note, if you are ready, or you know someone who is ready to take their leadership in the field of creative placemaking to the next step, I am happy to share with you that the New Jersey Institute of Technology in Newark offers the certificate, the professional certificate in creative placemaking, and our next course of study will take place in the fall, beginning in September, and we will complete that course before the end of the year so that you could have your certificate in hand before we come to the year 2020. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I will turn it back over to Molly and be delighted to answer your questions if you have any, to the best of my ability. Thank you.